Hello, I'm Roger Bisby from the Skill Builder channel, and in this video I want to tell you the ugly truth about cavity wall insulation. That's the kind of insulation that you pump in to your building after it's complete, rather than the stuff that is built in. Now, you might have heard some stories, you might have seen something in the press about all these people that have got problems with cavity wall insulation, and you may even be wondering whether it's worth you having it. If you've been offered it, is it a good idea? Or will it cause misery, damp and ugly black mould? So, if you have cavity wall insulation and you've come to this video because you're worried about it and you've got damp problems, I'm going to tell you a very simple solution which may solve your problems without having to have it taken out or to do any kind of extensive remedial work. A solution which you can do in a day, and I have found personally to be very, very effective and has even cured the problem within days of application. So stick around for that, but before I tell you that, I really want to take you through the basics, because having that bit of knowledge at the end is not as good as knowing exactly what the problems are, how they're caused and what you can do to mitigate them. So let's start with the cavity wall itself. So this isn't a cavity wall, this is a solid wall. This is what we call a 9-inch wall built with bricks which go long ways along there, and then the next brick goes across so that it binds the whole thing together. Now, this method of building was used for centuries, and in many cases it was perfectly adequate. What happened is that the wind-blown rain would hit the wall and the wall would get soaked, and then the sun would come out and dry up the rain and the wall would dry out. And if that wind-blown rain wasn't too severe, you weren't in too much of an exposed position, the damp would very rarely get through to the inside of the wall. And if it did, you had lime plaster on the inside, and that would evaporate any damp out of the wall. You wouldn't necessarily see it, and because you would have open fires and chimneys which were changing the air in the rooms up to about 8 times in an hour, any damp that appeared in the air would not produce mould or damp spots anywhere else. In some cases there were problems. The amount of rain that was driving through the wall was so much that it would cause damp to appear on the inside of the wall. So what they decided to do was to put a space between the walls. This space, this cavity, in this case it's 4 inches. We've got 4-inch wall there, we've got a 4-inch cavity and a 4-inch wall there, which is the modern way of doing it. But before they did that, they tried having a smaller cavity, sometimes as little as 1 inch, but very commonly it was 2 inches. So you had a brick wall, 4 inches, you had a 2-inch cavity, and then you had another 4-inch wall, giving you an 11-inch wall. Now, the advantage of that is that any wind-blown rain that gets through that first layer of brick, that outer skin if you like, will fall down as droplets to the bottom into the foundation and be taken away, soak into the ground if you like. That can sometimes cause problems if, when they were building this wall, they had mortar dropping down the cavity and collecting at the bottom of the wall. But in many cases, because we had a damp-proof course up here, any debris that dropped down the wall would be below the damp-proof course, and so there wouldn't necessarily be any transfer of moisture through to the inner skin. Because if you imagine you got this moisture and it's getting very wet, all that debris down there is getting very wet and it's soaking the inside wall, but you've got a damp-proof course which is stopping the water from travelling up into the wall and causing rising damp. In many cases, this cavity worked perfectly well, even when you had strong wind-blown rain blowing it there. Supposing you were living on top of a cliff in a seaside location or something like that, or on top of a hill on a Yorkshire moors, and you've got driving rain every day. It's coming through that outer skin, it's dropping down inside the wall, and it's being taken away. There are people that believe that you should ventilate a cavity, and people have said to me, I've seen air bricks in my cavity wall. Obviously that's there to ventilate the cavity. Well, that's not exactly true. Those air bricks should travel all the way through the wall on a sleeve to ventilate the underfloor area. This ventilation is underfloor ventilation, but it's not intended to ventilate the cavity. And in an ideal world, it's not always done, but it should be done. That cavity is capped off, bit of slate, bit of block turned on its side, or some bricks. But anything you can do to cap that cavity off is going to improve matters, because what we actually want here in this cavity is a dead air space, because a dead air space is insulation. All insulation works on trapping air, basically. So if we trap air in that cavity, if we've got good pointing, we've got good seal around the windows and the doors and everything else, and we can produce a dead air space in that cavity, that's going to help keep the house warm, because the heat from the house that's escaping through the wall is entering this dead air space, and it will eventually carry on through to the outside, but it will be slowed down by having to cross that dead air space. Now, as home heating started to become more expensive, they had the idea that what we needed to do was to put some fluffy stuff in here of some description, or maybe some polystyrene beads, to fill this cavity, to stop the air moving around to a certain extent, but also just to trap it into smaller pockets, so that when the heat was coming through the wall there, it would be lost or trapped in this insulation. Of course, nothing is 100% effective, and when we remember that this cavity is only 2 inches or 50 mil, that's not a huge amount of insulation compared to modern standards. In modern buildings, when they're building a cavity wall, they will put in 100 mil cavity, even bigger sometimes, even 150 mil cavity, and they will fill that up with insulation, and that will provide a more effective form of heat retention. But let's deal with this 2-inch cavity and this situation where we filled the cavity up. So what happens then to this wind-driven rain that is coming through and soaking the inside of the cavity? Well, some of it may travel across through the insulation and appear as damp on the inside. But if it doesn't do that, it may still soak all that insulation, and wet insulation is no insulation at all. So rather than benefit from having your cavity filled up with insulation, you've done no good whatsoever, and you've provided a path for moisture to get through to the inner skin. Now, the way you would see this very often is you would see damp patches appearing on the wall in various places, very often at the top, very often at the bottom. You get a whole band of it down the bottom, and you would think, okay, the cavity wall insulation is causing us a problem, because we didn't have that problem before we had the cavities filled. But what is actually going on here? We need to think about this, because a lot of people jump to conclusions, they rush into solutions which don't remedy the problem, and I've seen this time and time again. And what I want to do is take a step backwards. So let's take a given area of wall. It doesn't really matter what this is. It could represent the total area of your wall. It could represent just one wall. And let's assume that the moisture generated in the house through cooking, washing, breathing is producing, say, 10 litres a day across a wall which is, say, 10 metres by 10 metres, drifting around the house, and it's hitting the wall and the windows and everywhere else, and it's condensing on that wall because that wall is colder. Remember, at this point we haven't had the cavity wall insulation added. So we've got coldish walls, we've got moisture in the air, and we've got a whacking great 100 square metres for that 10 litres to condense on. So when you spread that out across the whole wall, it's condensing fairly evenly across the wall, because there are no warm spots, no cold spots particularly. You wouldn't even notice it. 10 litres spread across 100 square metres is no big deal. We warm the wall up. We've put cavity wall insulation. That may still condense on the wall. It's less likely to, because the house is warmer. We've got the same amount of moisture. We haven't reduced the moisture. We haven't increased the moisture. It's drifting around. When it finds a cold spot to condense on, it condenses on it. Now, you will see odd areas on your walls, up at the top corners, down at the bottom, and sometimes randomly in the middle, dotted around. And this will start appearing as damp patches on your wall, and those will eventually lead to mould, and you'll be wiping the mould off, maybe getting a bit of mould cleaner on there, wiping it off, and it will be coming back again. So you're thinking the cavity wall insulation is at fault. My cavity wall insulation is actually leaking and it's allowing moisture to cross the wall. That may be happening. More likely is that the moisture is just condensation inside your house, which is just looking for little spots to condense on. And because it's condensing on there, it's more concentrated, if you like. That 10 litres is finding those spots to condense on. It's not finding anywhere else particularly to condense on. Maybe in the back of a wardrobe, up in a bedroom you don't use very much, you'll notice a bit of mould occurring. Maybe behind a sofa which is pushed up against a wall, you'll find a bit of mould occurring because it's not heated to the same extent as the rest of the wall. I would say that before you do anything at all, check out what humidity you have in the room. Now it's very, very easy to do. You get yourself one of these. I got this one from Amazon, and you put these in the room. Not only does it tell you the temperature of the room, but it also tells you the relative humidity. So in this case, in this shed at the moment, we've got 51% relative humidity, which is quite low actually. In your house, if you've got anything less than 60% relative humidity, you're probably okay. But if it's above that, as it very often is, I've been into houses with my little devices and I've just placed them around the house and I've got readings of sometimes 80, 85%. Now in that case, the first thing that you need to do before you do anything else is to lower that humidity. You can lower that humidity by opening some windows, by opening trickle vents on your windows. If you've got double glazing, you've got sealed units, it's very likely that all that moisture is trapped in the house and you need to ventilate the rooms in order to get rid of it. But if you don't do that, put in some extractor fans. Don't forget that as those extractor fans are sucking air out of the room and you're not replenishing the air, you're not introducing new fresh air into the equation, very soon that extractor fan will stop working. First thing, ventilate. Extract as much as you can in the way of moisture and then see where you are. And I would recommend a dehumidifier to do that. Fairly cheap thing to run actually. They do produce a bit of heat, so you will notice in the room that while it's removing the moisture, it's also creating or recycling more like a little bit of heat back into your room. It works rather like a heat pump. So try that. And if you've still got moisture appearing, if you can open the cavity up somewhere and just feel it and it feels soaking wet, in some cases it's sopping wet, then the next thing you need to do is look at the outside of the building. And this is where I come to the very simple solution of applying a single coat of Stormdry to your walls, especially the ones that are in the exposed position, that are facing the driving rain on a regular basis, or the north facing ones because they don't have the benefit of the sun here to dry them out, so over the winter they do get wetter and wetter. So by applying a coat of Stormdry, you can very often find that over the course of a few days even, that insulation will start to dry out and it will start to do the job it was intended to do. It's not all the fault of the installers, but the new guidelines do say that when installers come to assess the job, when they come to look at the property, they have to take these things into consideration. And if you live on top of a cliff or somewhere like that where you've got driving rain coming in from the sea, they may say to you, it's not a suitable position, we're not going to put cavity wall insulation, you're better off without it. Even though your house may be freezing cold because it's in that exposed position, unfortunately for you, the best solution would be not to have the cavity wall insulation. Now, you may have seen these terrible stories in the press about people who've had cavity wall insulation in and they've been let down and they haven't been able to get anybody to remedy it because the company's gone bust. Now, the good news is that there is a cavity wall insulation guarantee agency, CIGA for short, and they will guarantee the job, and if the company goes bankrupt, they will get somebody else to remedy it. But I have to say that they keep figures on the amount of failures that they have, and typically the failure rate on cavity wall insulation is around 0.4%. And that may sound rather high, but in many cases when they look at it, it comes down to simple things like a little bit of bad pointing on the wall that needs repairing, or even leaking gutters soaking the wall and allowing the wall to soak up so much moisture. We see that time and time again. We've got a video about that. So it's very, very important that you just take care of that little bit of routine maintenance just as you always would on a property. And if you still have persistent problems with cavity wall insulation, at that point they may recommend that you have it removed. But before you do that, try that coat of Stormdry. This is not an advert, they're not paying me for this, but I have used it on many, many occasions and it has had a miraculous effect very, very quickly. Now, people do worry about the Stormdry, which is a siloxane coating, trapping in moisture. They've done loads and loads of tests, and I've done those tests myself, and I've seen the results of it, and it does not trap moisture. The amount of moisture that it slows down from evaporating out through that wall is so small that you can hardly even measure it. You can measure it in a laboratory, but it is absolutely negligible. The important thing is it's stopping moisture getting in and it's allowing the moisture that's in the wall to get out. So it's by far and away the most effective thing to do. And I would probably suggest that when in the future they put in cavity wall insulation, they should think about giving the house a coat of Stormdry. It's completely invisible. Once it's dry, you wouldn't even know it was there. And it does improve the R value of the brickwork, because if you dry brick out, if it's not absorbing moisture, dry brick is a better insulator than wet brick. If you did nothing else, giving it that coat of Stormdry would at least help. Now, there are other makes of coating around, of course there are, there's other silicons, but I would say be careful with them because some of them drive off, they don't last very long, and some of them do trap in a bit more moisture. So that's the sales bit over and done with. As I say, they're not paying me for this, but I do feel that if I find a product that's good, I have to recommend it. So if you do that and you just take care of that bit of maintenance, it may well be that you don't have any problems in the future. So remember, check that the wall is suitable for cavity wall insulation, get that advice, check that there's no defects like pointing and cracks and other things. Take care of your ventilation and your moisture extraction from within the building, and you should find that it improves matters no end. One of the problems that you get with cavity wall insulation is you sometimes get voids in it. When they're pumping it in through the wall with their little hose pipe, it gets to somewhere and it just doesn't, because it hits a wall tile or something like that, it leaves a void. And in those cases, you may find that you've got this cold spot, so you're getting condensation appearing on there. And if that's the case, the only thing that installers can do is to come back, identify those places, stick their little camera in, have a look to see if there's a void there and fill the void up. And again, under the guarantee scheme, that would be one of the first ports of call. But before they did that, they would be checking to see whether your cavity wall insulation was dry, more likely voids. And if it's wet, the problem is more likely to be penetrating damp from outside. The other problem you sometimes get with cavity wall insulation is that you get rodents, where they make themselves a lovely little nest inside the cavity, surrounded by that lovely fluffy stuff, keeps them nice and warm in the winter. If you've got a problem like that, those rodents are getting in somewhere, and very often you find that where they're getting in is a tiny hole that you probably neglected. Sometimes it's even underground. I have seen it in the past where there's been a missing brick and the rodents burrow their way under the ground, get up inside the cavity and make themselves a nice little home. If you've got problems like that, the only way to solve them is to go round and seal up all those holes and make sure that the rodents can't get in. And again, we come down to this sealing of the cavity. If you've got squirrels in the loft or rats in the loft, they can very easily get down into the cavity if the cavity is not sealed at the top. So don't listen to all those people who say that you need a cavity to be open, you need it to be ventilated. The exact opposite is true. And if they haven't done it, as in my case, in my house, I had to go round and I had to put in rock wool all around the top, just push it down inside the cavity, just below the roof line. And the great thing about that is that if you do have moisture in the cavity, as you will have, because as I said, maybe this water is dripping down here, you don't want air rising up through your cavity and carrying that moisture into the loft, even for no other reason, just to stop condensation in your loft caused by a cavity constantly drying out, you're better off sealing it across the top. Remember, it's all about air movement. If we stop the air movement, we can stop the moisture moving from one place to another. At the same time, remembering that we also need ventilation. So I hope that helps. I hope that's cleared it up. If you've got any questions, do put them in the comments below. If you've got any observations, but please don't come back to me saying that it's all a myth and that it's all the fault of cavity wall insulation, because I've had cavity wall insulation in my house over 25 years now, zero problems, no mould, and the house is warmer for it. And my neighbours had it at the same time as I did, and the first thing they reported is how much quieter the house was. The traffic noises, their kids moving around the house was all suddenly quietened down. Bliss.